He made strange statements, and two stood out in particular. First, that acts of parliament could dissolve marriages. Second, his Hanoverian background, his Hanoverian dominion, had been restored, and he was shortly to go there, to Germany. The reason this was strange is because George may have come from a line of German royals, but he was born in Great Britain and never visited Hanover. But no matter how strangely the king babbled, he retained his prudishness, and he never used any profanity, even in the depths of his madness. The highest praise, Colonel Digby writes, who remained at the king's vigil for hours in his room, that could be found of his character would not equal what in those moments showed itself, that with his heart and mind entirely open, not one wrong idea appeared, that all was benevolence, charity, rectitude, love of country, and anxiety of its welfare. This more docile period ended when he turned violent. By the end of 1788, his symptoms were unmanageable, and his doctors couldn't find any relief. In early November, the king and his son, George IV, fell into a conflict which resulted in the king grabbing his son and trying to smash his head against the wall. An observer commented that the king was foaming at the mouth, and his eyes were so bloodshot they had the appearance of currant jelly. The look of his eyes, the tone of his voice, every gesture, and his whole deportment represent a person in a most furious passion of anger. Other accounts by physicians and attendants describe the king as growing so agitated during a meal that he lost control, grabbed his son, the Prince of Wales, and threw him against a wall. He often spoke till he was exhausted, and the moment he could recover his breath, began again while the foam ran out of his mouth. After this, the king was restrained and put in a straitjacket and strapped into an iron chair, where he spent a lot of time while undergoing violent mood swings. Toward the end of his first attack, he begged the royal staff to end his life. On November 6th, the Prince of Wales, the Duke of York, physicians and equerries were reclining on sofas and chairs close to the king's apartment, when, to their shock, George appeared among them. He was as surprised to find himself among them as they were him. The king asked what they were doing there, as he didn't recognize the princes due to the dim lighting in the apartment. None of them had the heart to approach the sick king. Even his physician, George Baker, declined to lead George back to his bedchamber. The king suddenly recognized Baker, grabbed him, and pushed him up against a wall, telling him that his complaint was a mistake. Colonel Digby, the Queen's Chamberlain, stepped in. He told George that he must go to bed, took him by the arm, and tried to lead him toward his apartment. The king then cried, "I will not go. Who are you?" "I'm Colonel Digby, sir. Your Majesty has been very good to me often, and now I am going to be very good to you, for you must come to bed. It is necessary for your life." He was taken by surprise, and the king allowed himself to be taken to his bedchamber as passively as if he were a child. George's poor health and the mysterious nature of his sudden onset of madness gradually became known to the public. The British in general mourned, as the king was well loved at this time for being a pious royal. George Villiers, a young politician who was close to Princess Amelia, the king's youngest daughter, wrote on November 11th that the stock market had fallen 2%. Other nobles were equally alarmed. "You may easily believe," wrote Lord Sidney on November 13th, "that the hurry and ferment are great at present. People in general of all ranks seem to be truly sensible of the calamitous effects to be dreaded from an unfavorable termination of His Majesty's disorder." On November 28th, a cabinet council met to discuss recommendations from the king's physicians of George's removal from Windsor to recover in the open air at Kew Palace, the king's favorite royal residence. But he hated leaving Windsor so much, the aides realized their only choice was to force him out. It wasn't until his physicians swore that the convalescence was necessary that the cabinet adopted the advice. When George finally saw his lodgings at Kew, he burst into tears. Each examination of the king's condition provoked opposing diagnoses from physicians. Others began to rally against his physician for his lenient attitude toward George. Dr. Willis was criticized on 3 counts. First, that he permitted the king to read Shakespeare's tragedy of King Lear, a drama in which an elderly monarch's family schemes to marginalize and depose him, ultimately ruining him. The offending play was called "The Most Proper in the English Language to be Put into His Hands." Second, Prime Minister Pitt had given the royal patient a razor and scissors. Third, Dr. Wills afforded George interviews with the Queen and young princesses, allowing the royals to see their sovereign in a terrible condition. By December, he was described as under an entire alienation of mind and considered mad. The king refused food, became too restless to lie down, tore off his bandages covering his blisters, and threw off bedclothes. Willis responded to the king's behavior like he would any of his hundreds of earlier mental patients and strapped him into a straitjacket, a band across his torso, and his legs, which were bound to a bedpost. On Christmas Day, George dubbed his pillow Prince Octavius, who was to be newborn this day. He believed London under floodwaters and issued orders to those who had long died. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. During this period, political fault lines were opening up in England. Moderate Whigs and Tories supported Tory statesman William Pitt the Younger, while Charles James Fox led the more radical Whig opposition. Due to this squabbling factionalism, George's mental health became a matter of political opportunism. In the period of 1788 to 1789, his mental state was so unstable that the parties fought over whether the Prince of Wales, his son, should be regent, ruling in place of the monarch, who was considered too incapacitated to lead. Committees of Parliament asked the king's physicians if he could continue as head of state. In January 1789, it became unavoidable that the Prince of Wales' regency be named. A bill passed the House of Commons and was sent to the House of Lords, but at this point, George unexpectedly recovered. George surprised everyone by his rapid return to health and mental clarity. At the end of February 1789, Prime Minister William Pitt claimed that George appeared to be free from all disorder, that his manner was unusually composed and dignified, and that when he spoke of his illness, it was as a thing that had passed, which had left no other impression on his mind than gratitude to heaven for his recovery, as well as to those who had stood by him in his calamity. There was no sign whatsoever of his mental illness. In March, he was declared cured, though still described as emaciated and enfeebled. George regained his royal authority. Afterwards, the king sent for his old friends. He thanked them for what he called the affectionate fidelity with which they had adhered to him when so many others had deserted him. On March 10, 1789, an announcement to Parliament told of George's complete restoration to health. He returned to London to an illuminated St. Paul's Cathedral. The public was ecstatic. At the end of June, the king left Windsor to spend the summer at the seaside town of Weymouth in Dorset, 120 miles southwest of London. During the journey, popular acclaim greeted him. He attended a church service there, and the congregation was unable to restrain itself, bursting out into God Save the King instead of the appointed psalm. George resumed political leadership. He suppressed the 1798 Irish Rebellion, and then unified the British and Irish parliaments through Acts of Union, which created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. There are historians who believe George acted to establish the monarchical authority over Parliament that existed before the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which deposed King James II, who tried to build a centralized autocratic state. But George's actions suggest instead, most likely, that he was backing his governments instead of dictating to them. He did want to restore the monarch's power to choose his ministers, but once chosen, they had the freedom to govern as they saw fit. Further attacks came to George in 1804 and 1806, but the general impression of these episodes was that they were only temporary. Parliament accepted these explanations and didn't suspend any more royal functions. Physicians didn't examine him, and the public had no idea of the progression of George's madness. It's understandable that they ignored warning signs, as George exercised his prerogatives during these periods. On March 9, 1804, George received 15 bills and signed them all. He was keeping busy. Well, let's get back to the source of George's madness, which has been heavily debated for centuries. Researchers have tried to find the source of it since the end of his reign. He's been diagnosed with mania, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and countless other forms of mental illness, whether biological or psychological in origin. In George's lifetime, doctors did their best to determine his madness. Dr. Willis testified to a parliamentary committee in December 1810 whether George was mad or delirious. The doctor thought George suffered from delirium, which he said was less harmful than insanity. He said, "I consider the king's derangement more nearly allied to delirium. In delirium, the mind is actively employed upon past impressions, which rapidly pass in succession. In insanity, there may be little or no disturbance, apparently, in the general constitution. The mind is occupied upon some fixed assumed idea, and the individual is acting always upon that false impression. Also, the mind is awake to objects which are present. His Majesty's illness uniformly partakes more of the delirium than of insanity." This was one interpretation, but theories of George's madness were scattershot and all over the map until the 20th century. At this point, most researchers named the culprit porphyria, a blood disease. In 1966, doctors Ida McAlpine and her son Richard Hunter published the landmark paper, The Insanity of King George III, a classic case of porphyria. They claim that George suffered from acute porphyria, an inherited blood disorder that caused hallucinations, paranoia, confusion, insomnia, and restlessness. The diagnosis, they wrote, was plausible because George's cousins also suffered this disease. His extended family were royals across Europe, a testimony to the inbreeding of the continent's aristocratic class. The porphyria diagnosis, as a result, spread and entered popular consciousness. This diagnosis of porphyria was accepted at the time in the 20th century, and not only was it accepted in academic circles, but it soon entered the popular consciousness. This was the basis of Alan Bennett's long-running play, The Madness of King George. McAlpine and Hunter described 5 attacks of the illness, beginning in 1765, and they occurred until George's death. Although they claimed with specificity that George suffered from intermittent acute porphyria, the researchers couldn't find anyone among George's descendants who suffered from this illness. Their study concluded that George's condition wasn't a mental one, in whatever archaic or modern terms used to describe it. It may have been the first description of a rare metabolic disorder never completely understood. The two published the work Porphyria in the Royal Houses of Stuart, Hanover, and Prussia in 1967, claiming that George alone didn't suffer porphyria. He was joined by many other European royals, all of whose conditions originated from Mary, Queen of Scots, 200 years earlier. The British Medical Journal thought the research was so important that it published a supplement in the same journal issue, backed in royal purple, entitled Porphyria, a Royal Malady. McAlpine and Hunter claimed that James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, also had porphyria. He had repeated bouts of abdominal colic and nausea, vomiting and diarrhea, an irregular pulse, and spasms in his limb. Once an attack had begun, uncontrollable weeping also occurred. Jeffrey Dean, a physician who practiced medicine for 60 years, challenged the porphyria thesis in a series of articles in the British Medical Journal and in Scientific American. The British royal family was unafflicted with porphyria, he wrote, because in acute porphyria, the urine is a normal color when passed, but darkens when left standing. Medical accounts claim George III's urine was dark when passed. Additionally, the condition was unlikely to have passed directly down the royal family from Mary Queen of Scots to George IV through 9 generations. Professor Martin Warren put forward an alternate theory in 2003 that the same medicine which George's physicians prescribed to cure his insanity may have accelerated it. A British museum worker discovered an envelope in a vault that held a lock of King George's hair. It was subjected to analysis, and it was found that the hair had over 300 times the toxic level of arsenic. The source of the toxin could have come from any number of products used in the time, such as skin cream or wig powder. But no amount of those substances had that level of arsenic, even before people understood its poisonous properties. The answer to this mystery came from the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. George's physicians gave him a medicine, as they called it, that was referred to as antimony, and it had dangerous levels of arsenic. Physicians had the good intentions of prescribing him cures to sustain his condition, but they may have unwillingly poisoned him. George consumed a 120 milligram dose of antimony and arsenic